The text for our sermon this morning are these words from Exodus chapter 14, verse 25. And the Lord troubled the army of the Egyptians. He took off their chariot wheels so that they drove them with difficulty. When we have momentum or forward motion in our lives, things tend to go quite well. We have lots of ways to describe this phenomenon. We have wind in our sails. We're on a roll. We're in a zone. We're focused, productive, getting stuff done. And we find that time flies by. We find ourselves happy and content and useful. All feels right with the world. But when we lose momentum, it's a horrible place to find ourselves. Frustrated, seem to be thwarted at every turn, lost, distracted, can't seem to focus. We find ourselves being quite inefficient with our time, uninspired, tend to procrastinate. We have a wandering spirit. Think about it. We need momentum for lots of different things. Students need momentum to stay focused on their studies. Sports teams need momentum to stay at the top of their game. Healthy, positive momentum is needed in the workplace, in our relationships with siblings, family members, friends, and neighbors. In order for a relationship, like a marriage or parenting, to be healthy, we need positive momentum. We need momentum to get projects done around the house. But when we talk about momentum, we quickly realize it's more than simply having it or losing it. Because momentum is actually a constant in our lives, the same way that gravity is a constant in our lives. It's always there. Our spirit has momentum behind it at all times. This is a consistent teaching in our church, that there are spiritual forces, good and bad, that are propelling us forward. Sometimes that momentum is good, sometimes bad. Sometimes the momentum in our lives moves us toward positive outcomes, a considerate gesture, a kind word, a change in behavior, and sometimes toward negative outcomes, a hurtful comment, a bad choice, a regrettable consequence. And the point is, positive momentum lifts us up and carries us along, whereas negative momentum drags us down and causes us to get stuck and trapped. Well, in our sermon today, we'll be exploring how this negative and positive momentum gets played out in our own lives, and how the Lord can stop that negative momentum in its tracks and replace it with this invisible positive momentum, the kind that propels us forward to happier, peaceful states of life. And to do this, we'll be looking at the Exodus account of the Red Sea crossing, in which the Lord performs two miracles. First, by parting the Red Sea, which is the better known miracle, and then the second, by removing the wheels of the Egyptian war chariots, which is the lesser known miracle. So let's take a look at this well-known account in many ways, the Red Sea crossing. The full account, which you heard this morning in Exodus 14, serves as this incredible template for how problems and challenges typically present themselves in adult life. And it's such powerful visual imagery. The internal meaning or spiritual sense of Exodus 14 provides a fascinating behind-the-scenes look at the spiritual forces that are at work in our lives. So let's just quickly review this familiar storyline. First thing, and the most dramatic thing, is that the Israelites find themselves trapped. It's really quite painful to recount it. They had escaped into the wilderness from a life of slavery in Egypt. But then Pharaoh changes his mind and decides to chase after the escaped slaves and bring them back to Egypt. In their escape, the Israelites run out of desert and find themselves facing the Red Sea. And to make matters worse, they look behind them and they see the Egyptian army charging toward them. You can just sort of picture this cloud of dust in the distance. A detail I didn't notice before is that to make matters worse, the Egyptian army actually overtakes the fleeing Israelites and sets up camp by the Red Sea. But then the Lord places a pillar of cloud between the two camps so that the Egyptian army cannot see what the Israelites are doing. Then there's the expected result, despair. We're talking about being faced with seemingly impossible situations. Nowhere to go. Can't go forward, go straight into the sea. Can't go backwards, go right into the hands of the enemy. And so, not surprisingly, the Israelites say to Moses, "Have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Is this not what we told you in Egypt, saying, 'Let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than die here in the wilderness." But here's the beauty of this story. In the midst of their despair, in the midst of this frantic, what's going to happen now? The Lord causes a strong east wind, to blow all night against the Red Sea, which secretly prepares a pathway to their freedom. So, as is the case in any story in the Lord's Word, a problem is presented and the Lord offers a solution. And in this case, the solution comes in three parts. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. These are all commands. Remember that the Lord will fight for you. And then the third command, go forward, the seemingly impossible one to follow. So let's take a look at these three commands a little closer. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. What a beautiful declaration. Although in times of difficulty, it is extremely hard for us to stand still. Just think of anything when you hear upsetting news. Start pacing the room. And let alone what happens with our spirit. Our spirit becomes extremely restless. Well, what's the context here for them needing to stand still? Well, you've got this looming sea, the Red Sea. Think of the wording that we tend to use when we get overwhelmed, get flooded, overwhelmed. That is the cause, not just the natural cause for the Israelites, but the core spiritual cause too. Because in terms of New Church doctrine, what we're told is that the Red Sea represents temptation in general, and then the attack of the hells in particular. And this temptation or this trial that we undergo is all-consuming. It's an angst that we experience. I want to say a word about how the teachings of our church use that term temptation. Our teachings in the church have a very specific way of talking about temptations and what it means to be tempted. Almost always, when talking about temptation, The teachings of our church are not talking about the temptation to eat that extra slice of cake when you know that you shouldn't, or even the temptation to lie when you know you shouldn't, or cheat or steal, although obviously we need to resist evil and not do those things. Rather, the way that the teachings of our church talk about temptations is that they are this ongoing struggle for all adults, at least in terms of spiritual struggles, that are running in the background. Trial is really a better word for it. These struggles, these trials, are like a vast ocean, the sea. And like the sea, we have these waves that just keep on coming, keep on coming. And so we find ourselves beaten down and wearied, and we feel like we don't have the power to resist. These spiritual trials, these struggles, these issues that drag us down and beat on us like wave after wave, picture what the hells are doing in the background, that behind-the-scenes look in the internal sense. And their method of dragging us down and of hitting us with one wave after the other is to constantly harangue us and besiege us with condemnations. You're terrible at your job. You're not really being useful. You only seem to be able to make mistakes. You're failing in your relationships. You are alone. And you are a poor excuse for a father, a mother, a sibling, a friend. And so it is while we are staring at this vast body of water that's blocking our ability to think clearly that the Lord, through Moses, says, "Stand still." This means that if we can catch ourselves at that moment, and as this teaching you heard this morning says, recognize that salvation is from the Lord alone and not from us. If we can hold on to that idea, and the teaching says it is the chief idea, it should be the reigning idea to hold on to in these trials that we go through. Why? The teaching goes on. If we think when we are tempted, assaulted really, that we have the strength on our own to offer resistance, we will go under. End of quote. So that's an idea that we have to have in the back of our mind and recall as often as we can. Standing still, spiritually speaking, is to stop and recognize this chief idea, the most important idea to remember in our daily trials, that we don't have the strength to resist evil. Only the Lord has that power. We have many teachings that say this is an idea that we have to hold on to our whole life because it is so easy to forget. So that's the first command, stand still. The second one, the Lord will fight for you. It's connected, obviously. And to underscore the point that the Lord fights for us, in the story, we first learn about this strong east wind blowing all night. And that's said to represent how the Lord disperses the evils and falsities that are besetting us. And then there is this wonderful miracle that takes place during the night. No one sees it, this strong east wind that creates this pathway. A safe passage is opened up. And we can think of this visual image as what the Lord does when we find ourselves faced with impossible situations. A strong east wind comes when we call on the Lord and trust the Lord, opening up, parting the waters of those stormy ideas that are besetting us, and opening up a pathway. And so that's why we have this beautiful teaching. When we believe that the Lord alone offers resistance in temptations, we will be victorious. For we are then guided by the truth and ascribe the credit to the Lord. So beautiful, so powerful, so true, and so hard to stay holding on to. Now we get to the how. How is the Lord fighting for us? I love this. The answer lies in a simple, everyday object, a wheel. A wheel. Think about wheels in our lives. We take them so much for granted. But just try doing some gardening with a wheelbarrow that no longer has its wheel. Suddenly life becomes very, very difficult. Wheels are what propel us forward. Wheels are what give us momentum, positive and negative, as we're seeing in this account. That explanation, and the Lord troubled the army of the Egyptians. He took off their chariot wheels so that they drove them with difficulty. Wheels symbolize the power to go forward. That's the important part to remember here, the power to go forward. And this is what we would call momentum. The wheels falling off Pharaoh's chariot symbolizes how the Lord's presence, his goodness and truth, causes evil and falsity to lose its momentum. That's what that passage says. Quote, the power to advance falsities or lies was taken away. I want you to think for a moment about a negative idea or thought pattern. Think of it like one of the waves in the ocean that has gathered momentum in your life right now. And like one of Pharaoh's chariots, it thunders toward you each day, and it seems unstoppable. You feel powerless to stop it. And this is because fear and worry and anger and resentment all ride in Pharaoh's chariot. They carry a lot of negative momentum, and we don't even realize it, which can be stopped in its tracks if we just remember to call on the Lord for help. And why are we calling on the Lord for help? Because in this type of battle, we do not have the resistance, we do not have the power to combat that negative momentum. And that's why I love that simple imagery. Just imagine, it says that the Egyptians, after the wheels spun off their chariots, drove their chariots with difficulty. That seems to be an understatement. All forward motion stopped. Stand still. The Lord will fight for you. And then we come to the third. Go forward. And now we come to our part, our role. The first two commands in the spiritual sense contain two things that we need to be able to remember as best we can, because, as I said, we have these teachings that say we forget about it, it's hard to put that into practice, and it is a lifetime project to be able to truly call on the Lord and trust his power. So those first two commands, only the Lord has the power to resist evil, and that the Lord will fight for us. Now we have a role to play. We read, even though it is the Lord alone who offers resistance in temptations, this does not mean that we should let our hands fall to our sides and await influx. Rather, we should fight and move forward as though we acted on our own, all the while acknowledging and believing that we act from the Lord. And this is the great paradox. We do this, and we need to take that go forward step. Again, let's go back to that storyline and think of that impossible situation. Can you really think of something that would create more despair than being in that position, looking at the sea, trapped, turning behind, trapped. What are we going to do? And then there's this command, go forward. Seemed like certain doom. But as we know in the story, as the people crossed over on the dry seabed, they looked back in horror to discover Pharaoh's army charging towards them on these horses and chariots, but they kept moving. And the Lord intervened, stopping the advancing army in their tracks. One of my favorite teachings is this one that says, act precedes, willing follows. This is the easiest and the hardest step to do in our spiritual work, to put one foot in front of the other, no matter what the appearance may be. This is what requires faith, going forward, trusting that the Lord will do the heavy lifting. And think of all the excuses that we come up with. Well, I've tried it before. Go forward. What if I fail again? Go forward. I'm too old for this. Go forward. But, go forward. Well, we began our sermon today by considering the sharp difference between having momentum in our lives and not having it. When we have momentum in our lives, things go well. We're focused, we're productive, we get stuff done, time flies by, we find ourselves happy, content, and useful. And when we lose momentum or let negative momentum become the norm in our lives, we find ourselves frustrated, thwarted at every turn, lost, distracted, can't focus, and inefficient with our time, and uninspired, and procrastinating, and having a wandering spirit. And so in this miraculous Red Sea crossing, we learn how the Lord ever so carefully takes us through a process of removing the negative momentum in our lives, essentially the lies of the hells which we buy into, in favor of the Lord's positive, life-giving momentum found in the teachings of the Word. And so it really does come down to our ability and willingness to recognize the Lord working inside us. The more we can point to the Lord in our lives by recognizing His goodness, by recognizing His truth, by noticing the hand of providence, by seeing how He is leading us and guiding us each and every moment, the more momentum we gain. And like the psalmist, we say, "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." Amen.